We now come to the backbench motion on Valproate and fetal anticonvulsant syndrome. Norman Lamb to move.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on getting through that catchy description for this debate. And I'd like to start by thanking, on behalf of the all-party group for Valproate and other anti-epileptic drugs in pregnancy, the Backbench Business Committee for facilitating this debate. And I would also incidentally like to pay tribute to Janet Williams and Emma Murphy, who are present today, who have fought tirelessly on this cause over very many years, and we owe them an enormous debt of gratitude. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's fair to say that scandal is an overused word in political discourse, but I think the word appropriately relates to this issue. If you're a family who have suffered as a result of the mother taking Valproate in pregnancy, you would regard this as an absolute scandal, and I think we need to treat it in that way. In many ways, it has similarities to the thalidomide scandal. A whole group of women over very many years taking a drug during pregnancy without knowing of the risks involved, and really quite awful consequences, which I will come to a little later. And we owe them a duty. That's the really important point, I think, to get across. Now, Valproate was licensed for... I will.
To him. I apologise that I can't stay for the whole debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I too want to pay tribute to Janet and Emma and the campaign that they've run, and this great debate is a great tribute to their efforts. Would you agree that the real scandal is that we have known since the 1960s about the problems with this drug, but as the Right Honourable Gentleman says, mothers were not told, expectant women were not told, despite the fact that the government and the pharmaceutical industry knew that there were dangers?
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I completely agree with her. Interestingly, the original product licence in March 1974 states, so this is way back then, in women of childbearing age, it should only be used in severe cases or those resistant to other treatments. So they knew in the 70s, and yet the appalling scandal is that so many women since then have had their lives completely turned upside down, with enormous consequences for the children born, because they weren't told.
Give way on that.
I will.
So I'm really grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. My constituent Nicola, who took sodium valproate through her pregnancy, her son has chronic fatigue, and the impact on her family is immense and expensive. We have fought and managed to secure medical support for her through hospitals in Manchester. Would you agree with me that there needs to be some government fund to make sure people who are victims of this have that support and are not relying upon their own means?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I completely agree. I will be coming on to make that case a little later on, but it seems to me to be unanswerable, and I think the government needs to reflect on that. But it was worse than just a sort of neglect of not telling women. From the minutes of the Subcommittee on Adverse Reactions, this is the subcommittee of the Committee on Safety of Medicines, in the minutes from 18th of July 1973, this document has been uncovered, and it reveals a real outrage, because it talks about keeping it from women, keeping the information, deliberately withholding it, especially, it says, as it could give rise to fruitless anxiety. And it says, nevertheless, they thought it would be best if prescribers were all made aware of the nature of the evidence and recommended that a statement similar to that proposed by ICI in respect of another product could be included in all relevant data sheets, but not on package inserts, so that there would be no danger of patients themselves seeing it. It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. I give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable member for giving way on that point, and indeed on that very document. Would he share with me great disappointment if the original documents should go missing from the archive while these debates and this campaign is ongoing?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and I mean, issues like this are of enormous concern, and it does raise the question as to whether there needs to be some sort of inquiry or a Hillsborough-style panel to look at exactly how this has happened. But I also think it's really important that we focus on the top priority, which is ensuring that women get told, that it's not used inappropriately, and that there is a compensation package of some sort.
On that point,
I will.
Isn't it even more extraordinary, given what he said, that even now, this information and these warnings are not getting through effectively to pregnant women and their families? My constituent David Tout's own son has been affected by this. 20,000 children across the country in every single one of our constituencies. There's no sense of urgency from the MHRA or from the government.
Absolutely.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that, or the right honourable gentleman, and I think he's absolutely right. That's how I feel about this. There's the sort of sense of inertia. For goodness sake, for as long as women are not getting told, there are more babies being born. This is the awful horror of this.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way, but I think many of us have been approached by constituents or groups in this House about several of these kind of drug scandals that in actual fact represent a very paternalistic time when the patient was not part of a team in an open discussion with the doctor. And I'm sure that there are many of these that they should be looked at together, because the principles of all of them are the same.
Well, I think that's a very sort of profound comment to make, and it does reflect, I think, a changing attitude and culture, that it's thankfully now less paternalistic than it was, but there are still elements of that remain and that we need to keep fighting against. But I think she makes a good point that it relates to other products as well. Now, over the years since then, Madam, I'll take this, and then I ought to make some progress.
Thank you. Is he aware of the research done by the Independent Fetal Anti-Convulsant Trust, in fact, and they found that up to 400 babies have been born affected by Valproate since the toolkit was launched in February 2016?
Well, again, I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and I am aware of that figure. And again, it's shocking that it just makes the point that this is a continuing scandal. It's not something from the dim and distant past. It continues today. Now, through the period since the 70s, Madam Deputy Speaker, bit by bit more information has emerged. In 2000, the information given to patients was changed to refer to the warning, but it took until then for anything to emerge. And then in 2005, Sanofi added, and it's an interesting question, did this downplay the risk? And it's one of the points that I think raises the question as to whether there needs to be some sort of panel investigation of this. Because in 2005, Sanofi said on their warnings to patients, some babies born to mothers who took Epilin during pregnancy may develop less quickly than normal and may require additional educational support. Well, that's putting it at its mildest, because actually the implications were far more serious than that. And the question is, did they know then? So these things, I think, need to be investigated further. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's important to just address the question of what the risks actually are. Well, amongst the general population, there is a risk of fetal abnormality of 2 to 3%. But if Valproate is taken during pregnancy, that goes up to 11%. And the defects include spina bifida, malformations of the face, including cleft palate, the skull, limbs, organs, including heart, and respiratory issues. Also, and I think this is incredibly important not to disregard this, 30 to 40% of people taking Valproate during pregnancy, there is a 34 to 40% risk of developmental problems. And these can include life-changing issues, poor speech and language skills, delayed walking, talking, behavioural problems, interaction, communication issues, low intellectual abilities. The consequences of this is incalculable. Memory problems, noise sensitivity, sensory issues, ADHD, it's already been mentioned. autism spectrum disorders, and it's estimated that about 20,000 babies have been affected by this since the 1970s. And this is another important point. It has had a profound impact on the mothers themselves, who too often have been treated as if they are to blame for the problems that their children face, and who then face years of guilt. And this is the really shameful aspect of this. And I wanted to just turn to some case studies. Becky Parish, a mother from my own county of Norfolk, she says that Logan is 7 and was born with a 7mm unilateral cleft lip and palate, which the geneticist confirmed was due to fetal Valproate syndrome. He also has grommets and struggled with glue ear and bronchitis as a baby, has needed constant speech therapy, suffers ear infections. He has all facial features of FVS and is short in height and low in weight for his age. He has severe aggressional and destructive behaviours, including violence against others and self-injurious behaviours, and so it goes on. This is really significant. There's a danger, I think, sometimes when we talk about, in general terms, abstract terms, but when you actually hear the stories of families affected, you realise just how awful it is. In her case, she says, social services blamed me for it. This is the assertion that social services, in her case, thought that the problems related to an attachment disorder, with the implication that the mother was in some way to blame. Social blamed me for it, and so did the school. And now I feel more guilt due to it being FVS, because no matter how much someone says, I didn't know, and it wasn't my fault, the guilt never goes away, and sadly it never will. This is really shocking. She decided not to continue with Valproate when she became pregnant with her youngest child, who's now 5. And she says that this was not a difficult decision. Her child's health was, in her view, far more important than her own seizures, a terribly difficult judgment for her to make. But she stopped straight away, and she was not put on any alternative treatment, despite conflicting messages from health professionals. Her specialist nurse, wait for it, told her that she was being selfish.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
At her 12-week scan. However, her neurologist said that coming off the drug was the best thing she ever had. So 2 completely conflicting messages. Carolyn Allen in Southampton talks about how her son requires support for a number of effects of this condition, including deafness of his left ear, noise sensitivity, speech and language delay. And she says he has been referred to Portage, speech therapy, occupational therapy, ophthalmic, hearing clinic, physiotherapy, community paediatricians, and has already had 1 operation to release his tongue tie. Just imagine the massive impact on this family of this condition. Paula Hartshorn, a mother from Leeds, says the powers that be need to think about the devastating impact this has on families and how these families have to just cope and instantly know how to deal with all these complex medical issues. We have been left to give up on our jobs, our careers, social interactions and everything that goes with a well-rounded life. There are no breaks for us. And these stories, just in my view, are heartbreaking. Mazzy Southam from Blackpool tells a story of not finding out until her daughter was nearly 20, when she actually managed to meet Janet and Emma and started a voyage of discovery after she'd been diagnosed with learning disabilities, dyspraxia, social anxiety disorder. She had to fight to get a geneticist to actually give advice and to investigate it, and who eventually confirmed that she has fetal Valproate syndrome. A shocking fight to get justice in that case, which she shouldn't have had to go through. And she says, to me, she's an angel, and I wouldn't change her for the world. She said to me not long ago, I wouldn't want to be normal. I like my mad head. But it hurts me to say she doesn't and won't know any different, all down to the pills I took for my seizures. Just imagine living with that throughout your life. And the minister really needs to reflect that it seems to me the government has an obligation, a duty to these people to do good by them, and not to just say that they have to resort to the local authority or to the CCG for whatever might be available in their locality. There is a moral duty here, and we have to, I think, accept it just as we did with thalidomide. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I became aware of this scandal when I was Minister in 2013. I met with the campaigners in, I think, September of that year. I was completely horrified by what I heard. I knew nothing about it until then. And I asked the MHRA who attended the meeting for an urgent review of what was being done to stop more and more mothers giving birth without knowing of the risks. In October of that year, the MHRA did then ask the European Medicines Agency to undertake a full review. That review reached the conclusion, and it's very little different from what the product licence said back in 1974, that it should only be used if all other drugs are ineffective or are not tolerated. And they advocated a strengthened warning to ensure that all mothers were aware. Then in January 2015, the MHRA issued new information with stronger warnings, education materials, patient information leaflets and so on. And then eventually in February 2016, the toolkit was issued. Now, this is the toolkit. It may not look like a toolkit, but it is a toolkit. And it's of value because it gives information to clinicians and to patients about the risks involved. But again, the scandal is, and this has already been raised by those intervening, that it hasn't been communicated to very many of the women who've been affected by this. And so in September of this year, a survey carried out by the UK's 3 leading epilepsy charities, that's Epilepsy Society, Epilepsy Action and Young Epilepsy, found that these warnings are not getting through. 68% of women surveyed of childbearing age had not had any materials released to them as part of the Valproate toolkit. That's not acceptable, full stop.
The Right Honourable Gentleman for accepting a further intervention, and he's making a very powerful case. The Honourable Lady mentioned earlier the paternalistic approach that the medical profession had perhaps taken in the past. Would he be as shocked as I am to learn that that paternalistic approach was still on evidence when I met the pharmaceutical company Sanofi to discuss getting information out to mothers only about 2 years ago, when they said it would be inappropriate to make that information available unsupported by very detailed advice from doctors. Of course, it's important that they should be able to discuss the matter with their clinician, but women are able to understand and interpret intelligence too.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention. I also incidentally pay tribute to her for her work on this, on the committee, the all-party committee, and her campaigning. And yes, the response she got from Sanofi 2 years ago was unacceptable. And it just, again, seeks to, or has the effect of hiding from women the full extent of this risk. And women ought to be presented with the evidence and then able to have the full discussion with the clinician about what steps to take. But the survey in September of this year also found that 18% of women did not know of the harm. Not that they hadn't received the toolkit, they still didn't know. So the system is just simply failing those women. Now, I just want to... I will give way.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. I stand here as an advocate for my constituent, Ms Carol Short, who describes having her son, a 26-year-old, locked in a man's body but unable to do much more than a 10-year-old. And would he agree with me that it really is shocking with CCGs and all the funding that comes from the public sector that we still can't get this message through? But could perhaps one solution be shorter prescription times, which perhaps may mean more regularity in actually getting that advice?
Well, I agree with the point that he makes, and it's worth exploring that. There certainly need to be regular discussions, reviews of the woman's intentions about childbirth, but also the appropriateness of the treatment to that woman at that particular place and time. But that's something that should be investigated, I think, along with everything else. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to acknowledge a danger here, and it's a really important danger that needs to be properly considered. There is a risk that if all of the focus is on the risk of valproate, that women simply just give up and don't take any medication during childbirth, and that we then see a rise in unexpected deaths through epilepsy. And SUDEP Action raised this really important issue. 1,200 people die already through sudden unexpected deaths in epilepsy every year, and they estimate that about 42% of that total is avoidable. So we absolutely do not want to see any increase in that number. But for me, this just points the need for all women, indeed for all people with epilepsy, to have access to specialist teams wherever they live around the country. And my worry is that it's quite haphazard and variable what access is like around the country. Last Friday, I met with the specialist team in Norwich. It's a very, very good team, and I think and they explained to me how they've managed to reduce the use of valproate for women in childbearing years to a very, very small number. They say it's only a very small subset for whom there is no alternative. And then they can focus all of their attention on those women. But they said that that's not the case everywhere, that there's considerable variability around the country, that many women don't get access to the same specialist team. And so one of the things I would like the government to do and the Minister to commit to is to publish prescribing data for around the country. What is the level of the prescribing of this medication for every CCG around the country, so that we can pinpoint where overprescribing is taking place? And the interesting and rather concerning point is that if those specialists that I talked to are right, that it's only a very small subset, why is it that still, out of the 173,787 people with epilepsy taking valproate, 17,848 of those are women of childbearing age? This, to me, looks like a very substantial overprescribing, which is completely contrary to the guidance that is now being given. So if the guidance is clear that this should not be prescribed to women of childbearing age unless there is no alternative, or unless there is no alternative that is safe for that woman, why on earth are such a large number of women still being prescribed this medication? That in itself is a scandal, and the government needs to get to grips with it. And so I think the need for a holistic approach where women have access to specialist care, and where a full consideration could be given of the right arrangements for that woman to ensure that no woman is on valproate who doesn't need to be on it during those years of childbearing age, then we might start to see an end to this awful continuing scandal. So let me move finally to the steps that I think that we need to see from the government and from others. First, the toolkit must reach everyone. It must surely be mandatory, not a voluntary act. We can't surely, given the clear evidence from the survey of how many women are not getting this, we can't just rely on the current system to work, because it is not working. 400 babies born, as the Honourable Member said, since it was introduced. So this cannot continue. The warnings must be mandatory, along with raising awareness amongst GPs, pharmacists, specialists, midwives and health visitors. Second, there should be an annual discussion with your GP or with another health professional. The Epilepsy Society has argued that this should happen. It's very much consistent with the Valproate toolkit, which highlights the need for regular review, face-to-face discussion with a health professional before there is a renewal of the prescription. Third, there is a need for all women to have access to specialist units wherever you live around the country. We must end this haphazard variable position around the country, and we must address fully the concerns raised by SUDEP Action. Professor Ridsdale a consultant who has specialised in this area of policy says a useful outcome of this exercise would be that whoever prescribes Valproate agrees to identify and provide regular advice to women and girls at risk. Better still, that policymakers and providers start exploring how ongoing structured self-management advice might be offered to everyone with epilepsy. That's the ambition, surely, that we should set. Fourth, prescribing, we should publish the prescribing rates for Valproate for every CCG across the country. The government, I know, says it has a commitment to openness. This would be a good demonstration of it, because we will be able to identify where the real problems exist, where women aren't getting access to good enough advice. Fifth, we should ensure that only those women who absolutely have to take it during those childbearing years, as the advice recommends, are the ones who take this, and that we end what appears to be a significant over-prescribing of this medication for those women. Sixth, there must be, and this comes back to some of the interventions that have been raised, including from my honourable friend, there must be a financial support package. And this, in a way, comes down to the government's duty to these people. This is something that has gone on for many decades, so this is not something that's directed at this government. But this government has the responsibility here and now to do right by these people. There is an overwhelming moral case for it, and it's not good enough for ministers to simply say that support is available locally through the local authorities or the CCGs. These families have suffered an injustice. The government has a moral obligation to address it. And if it's right for thalidomide victims, it is right for those who have lost out severely as a result of Valproate. In France, a fund has been established, a €10 million fund, an initial fund. It could be added to. The government needs to take the same step in this country. Seventh, there must be a statement of regret or apology for the people who have been let down by the system so very badly. And finally, there is a case for an inquiry or for a Hillsborough-style panel to understand how on earth this outrageous scandal could ever have happened, how it has gone on for so many decades, letting down so many families across our country, and what lessons can be learned to ensure that this never ever happens again. Thank you very much.
The question is as on the order paper. If colleagues could stick to around 9 minutes, we will be able to get everybody in. Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk for so eloquently articulating the concerns that so many of us share about the taking of sodium valproate by expectant mothers. I'm speaking here today because I believe that there is a case to answer, for ministers to answer on the grounds of compassion and justice as to how and why pregnant women were allowed to take sodium valproate for so many years without they being better advised and informed, and without their unborn children being better protected from the risks, particularly since professionals became increasingly aware of those risks over the years, at least from 1973, because those risks, as we have heard, are huge. And at the end of the day, the people who should have been able to weigh them up and choose whether or not to take valproate whilst pregnant were the mothers. I appreciate that in 1973 we were, as has been said by a practitioner in medicine, in a more paternalistic era, but certainly not as the years went by, and certainly not by 2016 when this Valproate toolkit, this patient guide that I have in my hand here, was published. Mothers weren't given the relevant information, and sadly far too many still aren't, as we've heard. And it's absolutely critical they are, because this toolkit is stark. It states If you take Valproate when you are pregnant, it can harm your unborn child. And taking Valproate can cause birth defects and problems with development and learning. And in women who take Valproate while pregnant, around 10 babies in every 100 will have birth defects such as spina bifida, spatial and skull malformations, malformations of limbs, heart, kidneys and other organs. And about 30 to 40 children in every 100 will have developmental problems like learning to walk and talk, lower intelligence, poor speech and language skills and memory problems. The leaflet says, it is important you know about these risks. But for years, women didn't, when medical professionals did. Now, they might not have known, and probably didn't, all those details, but I have with me a copy of a letter from the Committee of Safety on Medicines from 1973. They're the precursor to the MHRA, in which they say, and they've referred to a number of studies in that letter, but they say, it is now clear from other studies that the use of anticonvulsants during pregnancy is liable to produce abnormalities as well as hair, lip and cleft palate. The risk appears to be low and not sufficient to justify stopping the use of anticonvulsants when they are necessary for the control of epilepsy. But nonetheless, there we have it, the fact that in 1973, that Committee on Safety of Medicines was aware. And then again, the licensing application in 1974, the documentation relating to that, which the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk has referred to, says that this particular product is licensed for use in general, focal or other epilepsy. In women of childbearing age, it should only be used in severe cases or those resistant to other treatment. So, we know now that as long ago as 1973 and 1974, dangers were being raised. And then we heard that in response to these concerns, the CSM instructed that an alert must not go on the package inserts. And I understand this was so that patients would be prevented from fruitless anxiety. But the fact is that because patients didn't see it, they were denied this information and therefore the choice to abstain from these drugs. But they had very much more anxiety for many of them when the reality was that there were thousands of babies born with life-changing disabilities and deformities which could have resulted from the taking of this drug during pregnancy. Yes.
Honourable Lady for giving way. Does she find it even more shocking that in 1973-74, when it was decided to keep this information from women, was exactly in the wake of the thalidomide scandal, when it should have been upmost in people's minds that women needed warning when they were pregnant about the drugs they took. The fact that it came after that should have made it more likely that they would have informed women.
Very good point. And I'll just go on to talk about some further warnings that were issued. I understand that there was a patient information leaflet from the producer Sanofi in 2000 saying, it is known that women who have epilepsy have a slightly higher risk of having a child with an abnormality than other women. Women who have to take Epilim in the first 3 months of pregnancy to control their epilepsy have about a 1 to 2% chance of having a baby with spina bifida. And then again in 2005 they added, some babies born to mothers who took Epilim during pregnancy may develop less quickly than normal and may require additional educational support. And some babies born to mothers who took Epilim during pregnancy may develop less quickly than normal or have autistic disorders. So through the years there were warnings that were coming, and yet still nothing was done to ensure that patients were told. Why did patients have to wait almost 30 years to be warned of risks? Women like the two brave women who've been referred to already by the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk, tenacious and brave campaigners, Janet Williams and Emma Murphy, who I too have had the privilege to meet. They've campaigned for years, they've set up a support group for affected families, and I want to pay tribute to them. and I want to tell you a little bit about their family situations. Janet has two sons, aged 26 and 28, Lee and Philip. Janet took Epilin during pregnancies, both of them, but nothing else. She told me, I wasn't offered anything else, and no one told me of the risks. Lee, at 26, has curvature of the spine, Asperger's, learning difficulties, memory problems, and he can't hold down a job. Philip, at 28, has even more problems. He has problems with hearing, vision, speech, language, walking, floppy joints, and is still fully dependent on Janet. Now, Emma, a generation later, had her children. Emma has 5 children, aged 8 to 14, Chloe, Lauren, Luke, Erin and Kian. They've all been diagnosed with a number of symptoms. All have problems, varied problems: autism, incontinence, deafness, cerebral palsy, curvature of the spine. All are slow to develop. Emma too took Epilin, the same dose during each pregnancy, and she told me she questioned it, but she was told it was the best drug to control her seizures and that her baby would be fine. She took no other drugs during her pregnancies. No one warned Emma of the risks. But the tragedy is, they are 2 women who tell me they represent over 1,000 in their support group, FACSA, the Fetal Anticonvulsant Association. And together they founded the registered charity InFact, the Independent Fetal Anticonvulsant Trust, to campaign for better awareness of the risks of taking Valproate to prevent further such difficulties occurring in the future, and to challenge government that there is, as I say, a case to answer. I do not believe we would be here today were it not for these 2 women. They really do deserve our considerable... Yes.
Reverend for giving way. Would she agree with me that women like Janet and Emma are ideally placed to get compensation should the government agree to a similar system to the French Depakine compensation system of 10 million euros?
I certainly think that's something which has to be looked at in, as I say, this case which ministers have to answer. Now, I would like to say much more, Mr Deputy Speaker, but time prohibits me. We have heard of some of the terrible statistics which have already been quoted, about 20,000 children who could have been affected since warnings were first known, or risks were first known, 400 children born each year still, of 28,000 women of childbearing age, and these are apparently according to ONS figures, who are still being prescribed the drug, and 68% of women who have it say they are still not properly informed of the risks. So, what do I ask ministers? Could I ask that the Minister would agree that significantly more needs to be done now, urgently, to raise awareness of the risks of taking sodium valproate by pregnant women or women who could become pregnant? Does he agree that whilst ministers themselves may only have come to know about these risks relatively recently, the producer Sanofi, the MHRA and its predecessor, the Committee on Safety of Medical Standards, did and should have done more to address these issues, to have published information, to have improved warnings years ago? Does the Minister accept that the support needed by mothers like Janet and Emma, where they have to care for their children with fetal valproate syndrome, is major, could be lifelong, and that much more needs to be done to look at how that support can be improved and funded? Janet and Emma tell me that the current provision through local authority, health and local council provision is wholly insufficient, and that care plans are needed for the many affected children. Is there any reason why ministers cannot, as I said at the outset, look at what we in this country can do more to support these families now without further delay, and certainly without awaiting a final decision of the European Commission regarding the link between sodium valproate and birth defects? We are, after all, leaving the EU. Does the Minister have full confidence now in the MHRA to effectively inform and guide healthcare professionals on the use of the prescription of sodium valproate for epilepsy? And does he think that the same could be said for the MHRA's involvement over the years? And finally, will he meet personally with Janet Williams and Emma Murphy and a group of us concerned here in this House about this issue at an early date to respond to their concerns and the call that I have today that there is, at the very least, on behalf of our government today, a case to answer with regard to this issue?
Paul Flynn. It was heartbreaking and infuriating to read the news that 68% of the women who are taking Valproate today weren't aware of the risks. This is a failure for all of us. We debated this in 2013 in March. We've had EDMs down. There was a whole programme on a television programme chaired by Hugh Edwards where the victims took part in this. We thought we'd cracked it. We thought we'd advertised this enough so that no one after that, after 2013, could be in the position where they didn't realise the terrible risks of taking Valproate in pregnancy were caught. And I'm not making any criticism of anyone on this except the MHRA, and I think we must look to the relationship that we have with the regulatory body. The minister, the previous minister, who did all that he could, and he's got a great honourable record here as a compassionate campaigner in himself for many issues, and it's a shock to all of us that we didn't expect the compensation to come along, but that's something that should be coming along, and it's not any kind of compensation in any serious way, but it is some admission that a terrible mistake has been made, not by the mothers themselves, but by the system. And it's helpful to look back at what happened during thalidomide, and I remember it vividly. There were 2,000 birth defects in the United Kingdom. There were 20 in the United States, and why was that? And the reason was that we went on prescribing Destival a year after the birth defects were suspected. And the reason was that the drug company were adamant. They tested it. They tested it on animals, pregnant rabbits even. And it was only when they came back and did another test on a particular strain of a pregnant rabbit that the birth defects were reproduced. But it shows the limit to animal testing. But when what the real difference was, that the regulatory body in the United States wouldn't accept thalidomide in that form, and it was used in a very small number of cases, so 20 compared to 2,000. We've had the effect of a drug called Vioxx, which was for arthritis sufferers. It's caused, according to the FDA in America, 60,000 deaths. Imagine it, 60,000 deaths. How many bad reactions did the MHRA have here in this country? About 6. We would still be using it if the FDA hadn't discovered that death was a side effect to taking this drug. It was taken by millions. We also have a fine in America against GlaxoSmithKline of, hard to believe, $3.5 billion. $3.5 billion for what? What they did, they suppressed the evidence of the trials they had. They carried out trials. They didn't publish any of the negative results, only the ones that were neutral or were favourable. And so drugs were getting onto the market that were killing people. And this is a British company. What did the MHRA do in this country? Nothing. I wrote to them and said, for goodness sake, you've got to act against GlaxoSmithKline. And it's no coincidence that the person who chaired the regulatory body for more than a decade was a previous employer of that company, GlaxoSmithKline. Now, I'm not saying that in this instance they did nothing in the regulatory body. They did produce the tools, the advice given out, but it clearly hasn't worked. If it couldn't possibly have worked if 68% of the women still taking it didn't know. I think we must look, and it applies to all governments, it's been raised many times before, that what we need is a regulatory body that's not paid for by the pharmaceutical industry, not controlled by the pharmaceutical industry, but is controlled nationally and is independent. They changed this in Italy some years ago. The pharmaceutical industry still pay for running the body, but each government for the last 20 years have said they weren't going to have a fully independent body because they didn't want to pay the money for it. It was fine if the burden was paid by the pharmaceutical industry themselves. I think I don't want to say that we're all against the pharmaceutical industry. They've produced miraculous results this century. Valproate is a very good drug, and everyone I've spoken to who has used it says that it's very effective, that it does reduce the number of seizures, of epileptic fits, the instances of bipolar disorders that it's taken for. So it is a very, very, we don't want to stop its use at all, and we want to appreciate its quality. But clearly, after these 4 years, when the evidence has been there, the vivid, heartbreaking evidence from the parents who've suffered in this way, that still nothing has worked. And we must look to both reforming our regulatory system, appreciating the value of the drug, but certainly giving the least that we can do is getting a fund which can express the sorrow of the country, our regret and repentance that we haven't sorted this matter out, that we haven't given warnings to possible future parents now, and to make sure that the reforms suggested by the Honourable Member for North Norfolk are proceeded with, and we should be doing it as a matter of great urgency.
I'm sorry, he's finished. Mims Davis.
Thank you. I was waiting for the Honourable Member to give way. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I too would like to thank the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk for securing this important debate here, as well as the Backbench Business Committee for allowing us time in this main chamber today to look at this issue, and also pay tribute to campaigners who've done so much to raise this issue. As someone who's working closely with constituents who's been so gravely affected by the use of Primados as a pregnancy test, I recognise the huge importance of airing these concerns on behalf of our constituents as widely as possible for all to hear. Now, there is so much work to do on Primados, and I'll hopefully be bringing those concerns shortly to the Prime Minister. But as the chair of the All-Party Women in Parliament group and former member of the Women and Equality Select Committee, may I take my time on my feet today to note, along with colleagues, that many backbench business debates, Westminster Hall debates, all seem to be focused on women's health issues. Valproate, Primados, vaginal mesh. So it really is great to see this issue being raised in the main chamber, and I just point that out for all people to see. So let's look at the issues here today. Yes, of course.
I think just coming back to the point that I was making earlier, that we seem to see these themes. I wonder, rather than multiple separate inquiries, whether we should actually be looking at things like Primados, like Valproate, because I think there are common learnings that need to come out of them.
I agree with the Honourable Lady, and hopefully in my remarks I'll go on to pull this together. So it's really important that we raise the case of sodium valproate, which is still, as we heard, still in use, and absolutely all those issues need to be looked at. So the common factors we've heard in the debates and the issues is hidden, missing and lost documents. In some cases, this is the mark of the type of concern that continued delayed education and information is always the mark of these cases as well. As I say, this is something we've seen in Primados and was raised again by the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk today in this debate. So I pay tribute to Sky News for their exposés in this matter, Valproate, as well as Primados, because this really matters to the families who are affected. Of course.
Thank you so much. You raised a valid point that there is media coverage on this issue because it's being raised in the Chamber today, and I congratulate the members for bringing it forward. One of my concerns about it being raised in the Chamber, it might make some women nervous about taking medication if they are pregnant, or considering whether they want to fall pregnant if they are on medication. So surely one of the messages we want to send out today is please consult your doctor and just don't respond to everything you read in the press if you are taking epilepsy medication.
Very good. I thank my honourable friend for that. Yes, many of us will have constituents, friends or families affected by epilepsy, which in itself is very serious, and of course perhaps maybe bipolar disorder. So it's really important to recognise that the appropriate use remains very important. It can be effective and a useful treatment in the vast majority of patients, if done right, if managed, if educated and if understood. So the argument, therefore, should not be, I think, about ceasing the use overall, but instead perhaps finally telling the truth and appropriately looking at the use during pregnancy. And of course men use it too, so we need to be balanced in that and reflect all situations. Yes, of course.
She's making really good points. I just wanted to make the point, I totally agree with her that this is an appropriate drug for most people, but I just want the guidance to be followed. And the guidance is clear that for women of childbearing age, it should not be used unless there is no alternative. And we just need to stick to that guidance and make sure it's actually implemented everywhere.
So absolutely, speaking about this issue in this chamber will empower our women constituents before and during pregnancy to make the right choices and to be informed, and that absolutely should be the outcome we should all be hoping for. Now, yesterday during a debate in Westminster Hall on mesh implants, very similar issues, that mothers in particular, new mothers, had taken advice that they were given without hesitation. And absolutely the same goes for your first pregnancy. Your body is changing, it's an unsettling time. I would imagine for people suffering from epilepsy or bipolar, this would be even more a nerve-wracking time. So it's absolutely right that we're measured in our conversations on this. And it's important that our specialists ensure that women in this position are given right and proper guidance, and that patients absolutely need that knowledge, and patients need that more than anyone. They live with the consequences if things go wrong, and they will always look at their decisions looking back. But if they haven't had the information, how can they truly know they've made the right decision for them and their family? Often siblings impacted as well. So the government has a really important role today to play, and MPs as well, about raising awareness around any medical situation during pregnancy, including sodium valproate. And I recognise the efforts that have been made with the labelling on the packages, and I'm sure the Minister will agree with me that there is more that needs to be done. This drug, introduced back in 1974, has been crucial, but the support from the families affected is also crucial. I do welcome that young people who've been affected are now going to be included in the new framework for health and social care for children and young people. It's been a real battle, but CCGs and local authorities are getting to grips with that. So it's really important they get that support on a local level. And can I also welcome the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State's meeting which is forthcoming with the APPG on this. I know that the ministers are taking this seriously, but I do ask the Department of Health, and this is where I started in this speech, about some assurances around women's health issues. The similar issue around Primados, the similar issue around mesh campaigners. We have moved into an incredible place on blood contamination. Some of my constituents affected by that, and I have been written by constituents in EC about raising this one. We wish to see more action, and there is a common denominator here. Of course.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would she agree with me that 2 years ago I asked the Minister to extend the Primados inquiry to include Valproate, and that was declined because I was told that the two issues were very different, yet they seem to be quite similar. Does she think that was a missed opportunity?
I think any opportunity as a woman standing here in Parliament of not raising women's issues is absolutely a missed opportunity, and I know the Minister's listening intently. And I've heard the issue raised by the right honourable member, I'm not sure, member for Newport West, about the seemingly cosy relationship that the MHRA has when it suits it, or sometimes the laissez-faire attitude it has when it suits it. It's incomprehensible that there can't be more independence injected into this area. We need openness, we need reform. Therefore, I would also like for the Minister to take a look at the position in France on this issue and consider setting aside some funding for perhaps a compensation regarding medical accidents. Few of us in this chamber can imagine the hardship, guilt and heartbreak of the impact of taking a simple prescription drug during a pregnancy and knowing that it may or may not have had an impact on the child that you receive. And I'm very lucky to have two healthy, beautiful daughters, but we are all absolutely at the mercy of decisions that we take during our pregnancy and also the professional guidance that we get. We are very fortunate right now to raise the opportunity of awareness for people going forward in this situation, but there are those who have not been lucky enough to be informed of those decisions. So this is a really important debate today. I urge the Department to actively work with the MHRA to give patients full confidence both in them and all pregnancy matters.
Liz McInnes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased that we're having this important debate today, and I want to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for North Norfolk for securing a discussion on this subject and also for setting out so clearly the issues that we're addressing today. Now, my career before I was elected as Hayward and Middleton's MP was as an NHS clinical scientist. Working in a biochemistry laboratory, I was very familiar with sodium valproate as part of the battery of anticonvulsant drugs for which we regularly tested patients in order to help their clinicians better monitor their treatment and ensure that their dosage was at the optimum level. However, until I met Emma Murphy and became aware of her campaign, I was not aware of what appears to be a systematic failure to inform women of the potentially damaging effects of taking valproate during pregnancy. Now, Emma herself only became aware after watching a television programme about fetal anticonvulsant syndrome that her own children's health problems were probably attributable to the anti-epileptic drugs she had taken whilst pregnant, which had been prescribed to her from the age of 12. And like everyone, I think, in the House today, I'd like to pay tribute to Emma Murphy and Janet Williams for the great campaigning work that they've done and that they continue to do. The damage to the developing fetus is thought to be caused in the first trimester of pregnancy, when the anti-epileptic drug crosses the placenta into the fetus, and the effects depend upon both the dosage and the drug. But sodium valproate, or Epilim, is indicated in 80% of cases of fetal anticonvulsant syndrome. And experts such as Dr. Peter Turnpenny, clinical geneticist at the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital, say that Epilim may affect around 560 babies every year. He goes on to say, and I quote, "About 10% of fetuses exposed to sodium valproate will have a major congenital malformation such as cleft palate. 12% are likely to be diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder." Reports linking valproate to birth defects started to appear notably in 1981 with a paper by H. Now entitled "Sodium Valproate and its Metabolites." The British Medical Journal published an article in 1983 from the Royal Liverpool Hospital citing 2 cases suggesting a link between birth defects and valproate taken during pregnancy. The American Journal of Medical Genetics cited 7 cases in 1984 of children born with malformations to mothers taking valproate. The Journal of Paediatrics cited 26 cases in 1986. And the list goes on. And it would appear that the evidence was steadily building up with the publication of more and more cases linking valproate to birth defects. The Committee on the Safety of Medicines and the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency noted these reports and, I hope, monitored valproate, particularly in pregnancy. Certainly I'll give way.
With all of these various scandals, the member for Newport West mentioned Vioxx, where trials have not shown a problem and it's the real-world use that shows a problem. Does the Honourable Lady think that we need some kind of reform of the reporting system? We call it a yellow card. It is now that patients can fill it in themselves, but many of them don't realise that. And I just feel there's not enough flagging up that actually a patient is suspected of having a side effect.
Thank the Honourable Lady very much for that intervention, and I think she's absolutely right. She's well aware of the yellow card system. I'm well aware of the yellow card system. We've both worked in the NHS, but how many people out there know that they can report side effects of drugs, or even if they've got a suspicion? And I think we really have a job to do to get that message out to the general public. And also we need to have people who are going to collate that information and act upon it. So thank you. Now, the definitive paper stating that there was a clear link between valproate taken in pregnancy and birth defects was published in 1995, entitled Fetal Valproate Syndrome, and it was written by geneticists at St Mary's Hospital, Manchester. So it's clear that the evidence has been building up for a long time. So why does it appear that women were not warned about the potential dangers of taking the drug in pregnancy? Certainly.
Just a quote from that 1995 report. The study concluded the risk of fetal valproate syndrome when babies are exposed to valproate is significant. Significant.
This weekend.
Yes. And I think that was probably the first paper to say this isn't just coincidence, this is actually a causal relationship. And for that reason it is seen as a definitive research paper. Now, many people have already mentioned the pharmaceutical company Sanofi, and they have stated that they have kept in line with scientific knowledge when reporting side effects to the fetus. But from as early as 1983, the Committee on Safety of Medicines and the MHRA reported on the problems caused by taking sodium valproate in pregnancy, but did not insist that Sanofi issued warnings in the form of a patient information leaflet. And even now, to this day, epilepsy charities report that women are not aware of the potential risks when taking the drug in pregnancy. And I know this survey has already been mentioned, but I don't think it does any harm to actually try to reinforce these findings. The survey showed that 18% of women taking sodium valproate were not aware of the risks during pregnancy, and 28% said that they had not been informed of any risks. And this is despite the MHRA producing the Valproate Toolkit, which is designed to help healthcare professionals talk to women with epilepsy about the risks of taking valproate during pregnancy. Certainly I will, yeah.
I'm very grateful that she's making an incredibly valuable contribution. Would she agree with me that if it's clear through a period of time that the amount that it's being prescribed is significantly more than the guidance would suggest was appropriate, that it's not acceptable for the drug company, for the regulator and government simply to be passive and to allow that to continue? If we know it's being overprescribed, and it appears to be the case, why on earth wasn't action taken?
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention, and I think that's a very good point. And I think that's a point, if we do manage to establish an inquiry, I think that's an issue for the inquiry to look at about the overprescribing of this particular drug. I also want to mention other agencies. The European Medicines Agency have also recommended a strengthening of measures to reduce the risk of harm to babies born to mothers taking valproate. And information from the House of Commons Library outlines a situation in France, which has already been referred to, with an estimate that between 425 and 450 children were affected by birth defects attributable to valproate from 2006 to 2014. And the French Parliament this year voted to set aside €10 million for claims related to Valproate, which the Health Minister, Marisol Touraine, described as a starting point. And she stated that compensation would ultimately be paid by those deemed responsible. She said, "I regret that Sanofi didn't seek an amicable settlement as a matter of principle. I hope Sanofi will change its position." Sanofi had no comment to make on the Minister's remark. Additionally, a class action has been brought by the French Association for People Affected by Sodium Valproate against Sanofi. In the UK in 2004, a class action was brought by a group of families under the Consumer Protection Act 1987, which was expected to go to trial in 2011, but the litigation was discontinued prior to this after the Legal Services Commission withdrew funding. Now, it's disappointing that this government have said that there are no current plans to introduce a compensation fund similar to that in France, and I would urge the government to reconsider. I fully support the remedial steps outlined in the motion, including the call for an inquiry, and this government must bring forward a care plan and financial assistance for the victims of this national scandal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Let me begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Norfolk North, for securing this important debate on valproate and fetal anticonvulsant syndrome. It is an important debate and one I hope will compel change. I'd also like to join my colleagues in putting on record my thanks and admiration for the Facts Association founders Emma Murphy and Janet Williams, who are here today. Emma and Janet are an inspirational pair, turning their life-affecting experiences as victims or knowledge of victims of this syndrome towards justice on this issue and a demand for better knowledge of the risks sodium valproate poses our unborn children. I speak, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as someone who, for 10 years or so, took sodium valproate, not in utero but in childhood. At 7 years old, I was rushed to hospital with meningitis. Within a few hours, I was fighting for my life and in a coma for 2 days before responding to a spinal tap. I was one of the fortunate ones and survived without any of the known side effects, as deafness, blindness, amputation or death are routinely followed when suffering from meningitis. Instead, I was left with epilepsy for the 6 years that followed. I got pretty close to the NHS, its outpatient wards, the brilliant teams of nurses and doctors who worked together to get me better. I was prescribed sodium valproate, and I took Epilin, which I dutifully took, for at least 6 years. So I stand also to give voice to epilepsy sufferers in this country. Let me give you a sense of what it is like to endure a convulsion. There is a stillness at the control centre of your mind, but a violent movement of the body. An arm, the head, or legs. You are aware of it, but unable to prevent it or stop it. You can, I recall, steer it, though I would not know how that is so. I remember now, as a young boy, as with most siblings, enjoying bunking down in a bedroom with a fellow sibling, and in fact being able, in the very rare occasions I had convulsions only ever between the hours of 4 and 6 a.m. in the morning, managing to wake my sister, for whom we had enjoyed a sleepover in one of our bedrooms. She alerted my parents, and I was really observed until this convulsion stops, because there is nothing you can do. Epilin, sodium valproate's commercial name, is widely thought to have been the greatest contributing factor in curing me of epilepsy. But for a simple twist of fate, my consumption of this drug may well have been at a different time. When presented with the National Archive papers of minutes from 1973 and 1974, when decisions were taken to withhold the knowledge of this risk to fetal development by Emma and Janet, I was stunned. Notes in these meetings, in the minutes 1973 and 4, advising 2 consecutive different governments not to include any warning or information on the risk. This is all too familiar. Another national cover-up, further scandal from those closed decades. The we know what's best for you approach taken by the few to the many, and has been said very often by men to women. The long wait for social justice and a burning injustice finally coming to light. A conspiring against the women for whom they were prescribing. So I do not rise to spread fear, but knowledge of sodium valproate. I stand here as record of its effectiveness, but I do not stand up without remembering the unborn children, the women and expectant parents for whom the risks are not widely enough known. So I welcome the warnings will feature on the outside of packaging, and hope from here our medical leaders and the government will appreciate the issuing of guidance, but recognise that the issuing of guidance is not the same as ensuring knowledge. I wholly support practical steps, the distribution of the Valproate toolkit to all clinicians, pharmacists and women prescribing the drug. But the government has a duty to respond with practical steps to address this problem, because our fight is as much with the cover-up as it is for the clear picture we need to send parents where mum is taking Valproate. Let this be another moment where we draw caution for all those in positions of power, for whom they're about to make decisions that keep people in the dark, withhold information that's life-affecting, life-changing, or poses risk to life. Life will catch up with you. The good will out. It is the mark of an open and tolerant society that we are all here to steward, where freedom, equality of access to information is a guiding principle to life in it. And on health, not decisions made for us, but decisions taken with us. Nothing about us without us. A democratic voice at the table, an informed patient choice, not deals in the dark. We've a democratic deficit in decision-making on health matters and services. And sadly to say, on evidence of last night, there's a democratic deficit from this government too. A government listening, they say. We've a government that refuses to hear, is what I think. So I urge the government to listen and hear us when we say, make amends for this national scandal. Look at compensation. Address the lack of knowledge. Apologise to the women and children who are now men and women themselves. And make clear our instruction from here that no content or information pertaining to health and medical prescriptions and the decisions for patients to make is ever withheld again. Thank you, Mr.
Jim Shadder.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's always a privilege to speak in these debates. I make a special consideration for the honourable gentleman from Bury North, who just gave a very personal but a very, I believe, a very powerful personal summary of his life, and we appreciate that. It has added to this debate greatly, and I think all of us who heard that debate and his contribution will greatly appreciate that. We want to say thank you. Also to the honourable member for North Norfolk, who set the scene so capably, so well, outlined the very systematically the case for addressing the issue of Valproate and fetal anticonvulsant syndrome. I also would pay credit to his summary at the end, which I'll speak about later, but and the 8 recommendations that he put forward, and if there was 8 recommendations to follow, those are the recommendations, and I think any of us in this House would adhere to that. And can I also thank all the other right honourable and honourable members who spoke, because their contributions were equally important and for this House, and the interventions as well. I always think that the House speaks and probably shines better whenever we have issues where we can all have an input into from a personal point of view on behalf of our constituents, and this is one of these issues. There is no greater gift from God than that of a little baby. I have 2 wee granddaughters, and we adore them. We don't maybe spend as much time with them as perhaps we should have. Maybe we don't spend our time with our children, but with our granddaughters we try to, and they're both perfect. Certainly, in my opinion, they're perfect, even though they might have some tantrums. And being wee girls, maybe they have different tantrums, because I don't have boys, so I only reared boys, so I wouldn't have knowledge of both. But I watched my parliamentary aide, and I want to make this point. As she refused her normal 10 cups of coffee, and we live in coffee in my office, and probably maybe in everybody's office, I suspect. But she drank only caffeine-free beverage for 9 months during her pregnancies. Indeed, it was my first indication, I have to say, that she was expecting again whenever she wasn't taking coffee. But it told me something. Here was a girl who had 2 miscarriages, who had 1 baby and was expecting her second one, and she was going to take every step that she could to make sure that the baby was perfect. The reason why she didn't take the caffeine was, she said, that the baby's heartbeat would be a little fast. So mothers will do almost anything to ensure that they protect their little life when they know of its existence. That's what mothers want to do in this House, outside of this House. But unfortunately, this debate has illustrated very clearly that some of those mothers didn't know what was happening, and that's why I feel so strongly that there must be more research done for those mothers who have the long-term health problems and who do not know how the medication they must take to deal with this may affect their children. Every member who has spoken has illustrated that, and I just throw this into the equation because I'm aware of this as well. I think of those who have ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, amongst others, and who are on infusions such as infliximab, who have to come off these if they want to get pregnant. So there are things there that are told to some people, but did every person know that? I suspect they didn't, but I think they should. And I think it goes back to some of the interventions by the honourable member from the Scots Nationalist Party, who referred to the yellow card, and the honourable member who spoke to that as well. Those are incidents where people need to be aware of. More needs to be done to ease the mind of these families. And that's why I join with my colleagues today to ask for more to be done in the case of this epilepsy medication in particular, but more long-term medications in general as well, because I think we have to look beyond this debate and encapsulate what other people are saying. Sodium valproate is an epileptic drug that is associated with greater risks in pregnancy than the AEDs. There are other valproate medicine, for example, the valproic acid and valproate sodium. The Medicines and the Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency report that whilst the general risk of a fetal abnormality is 2 to 3%, in women taking sodium valproate, the risk is around 10%. Did they know that? This debate, I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, would illustrate that they didn't, but they should have, and we have to address the issue as it is now. The birth defects can be spina bifida, malformation of limbs and facial and skull malformations. It also states that the use of sodium valproate in pregnancy can affect the child's development. And many members, and the powerful speech by the member for Bury North tells you exactly what it does in this House, as said by himself and by others. It delays in learning to walk and talk, lower intelligence. Again, other members have referred to that, until of the same age and poor speech and language skills. We've had many unfortunately, scandals over the years. The thalidomide is one that I can relate to because of my constituents who have come to make me aware of it. The honourable lady who spoke yesterday in the mesh implants debate in Westminster Hall, which I spoke on as well. I was contacted by a large number of those, but you know something? They didn't know that either. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. But yet and all, they had the repercussions of years and years. There was one honourable member referred yesterday to a lady who had to go in 3 times over 2 years, over 6 years it was, to get operations before they eventually got it cured. And primitus as well. I mean, I was talking to one of the honourable members who's not here, and he was referring telling me that he had been involved in this one. So there are lots and lots of issues and lots of scandals, and I think we need to do what other members have said and bring this all together, perhaps under one headline. To me, although I'm not a doctor, I don't have any doctor skills. I I probably can read things that, where it comes to symptoms. I don't have any medical training. It would appear that this rate is significant enough that people should be fully informed of the significant risks before they're prescribed the medication. So it is embedded in their mind that there are massive risks with pregnancy and these drugs. I'm sure that many of us were supplied the briefing from the Epilepsy Action, and their statistics are hard to read, but they're very clear. But I would want to refer, if I could, just to one of some of the background, and thank Hansard as well for their very in-depth information they give us to prepare for this debate. I want to quote one thing from that, if I can, and they refer to the survey because other members have referred, go back to 1995 and 96, where this was first mooted. There was a problem, and nothing really seemed to kick in to take action. And they refer to this survey as been repeated in 2017, when it was found that 18% of women taking the epilepsy medicine sodium valproate didn't know the risks this medicine can pose during pregnancy, and 28% of women said that they had not been informed of the risks of this medicine in pregnancy. How can that be that the lessons haven't been learned? Dr. Rise Thomas, Honorary Consultant in Epilepsy at the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle, said this is a dramatic and important survey focusing on a crucial area for women with epilepsy, and as a medical community we clearly could be doing more and should be doing more. Even if women are being told of the risks, this may be at the wrong time for them or in the wrong way. So sometimes when you tell a story and you tell what the risks are, the way it's told isn't done in a way that they can even understand it, and that has to be wrong. So the conversation needs to be had, but it also needs to be repeated, and people need to be aware of that. And I'm not so quite sure if that's been done in the way that it should. The Epilepsy Action and statistics are as follows. Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency figures suggest that up to 4 in 10 babies are at risk of development disorders if valproate medicine is taken during pregnancy. 4 in 10? Yeah. That's massive. Yeah. I mean, how can that be ignored? Yeah. Approximately 1 in 10 babies is at risk of physical birth defects. Babies affected by sodium valproate can have severe problems that require lifelong care and support. You know, are we looking at prevention? Are we looking at the future? Are we looking what the long-term care will be? I suspect we're not. It's estimated that 20,000 babies have been affected by sodium valproate, and in total 400 babies a year are born to women taking sodium valproate. Epilepsy Action, Epilepsy Society and Young Epilepsy have conducted a survey of over 2,000 women with epilepsy. I found that some women are still not aware of the risks of taking epilepsy medicine in pregnancy. More than a quarter, 20% of women taking the epilepsy drug have not been given information, as I said before. And again, conscious of your indication, and I'll come to the conclusion. Again, this would indicate to me that anyone who is on the medication should have taken time by a knowledgeable medical professional to go through the risks of being pregnant whilst on the drug. I know this is after you become pregnant may well be too late. Therefore, the discussions with your GP are very important. As it's not a matter of simply stopping the drug when you get a positive pregnancy test. This is not safe to do so. And I would urge, in conclusion, that to follow the 8 points, but I say this, do the compensation fund that we all in this House want to see, because that will at least help those families deal with the financial positions that they're in. Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you.
I'm just going to bring Cat Smith in. If you could finish at 1:30, I'd be very grateful. And could we try and see if we can get about 9.5 minutes from the wind-up speech in order to bring in Norman Lang. Cat Smith.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to be squeezed into the end of this debate, and I will be very brief in my comments. This debate really started for me within days, actually, of being elected as a Member of Parliament in 2015, when my constituent, Janet Williams, got in touch and asked whether or not she could meet with me. And when I was first elected as an MP, I imagined I'd be meeting most of my constituents back up in Lancashire. But Janet, I think, was very keen to get a meeting in very quickly and actually chased me down to Westminster, and I met with her in Portcullis House along with Emma Murphy, both of whom have been mentioned quite a lot in this debate, and I pay tribute to the work that they both do on this very important issue. And when I met Janet, to be honest, my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe that in this day and age we were still in a situation whereby women were being prescribed drugs which were harming their unborn babies, and they were not being told about it. But it wasn't just that they weren't being told about it, but frankly it was a cover-up. And I find this to be a national scandal, and I do not use those words lightly, because for Janet's sons, Philip and Lee, both of whom I've met and of course are my constituents too, this is a life sentence. And Janet should not feel guilty for taking the drugs that her doctors told her to take during her pregnancies, but for her sons, they will continue to need care throughout their entire lives. They are 2 young men in their 20s, and that's certainly a huge social care need. Now, this scandal started in the 1970s, but as I've said, Mr Deputy Speaker, it continues today. Today, there are women in this country being prescribed this drug, which is a great drug. It's a very effective anti-epileptic fit drug. It's very good at treating bipolar and also migraines. But we need women to have knowledge. We need to share knowledge with women so they can make decisions over their own bodies and over their own health in pregnancy. So I would like to urge the Minister in his response to, and colleagues have mentioned this already, to respond to the call to publish prescribing data so that we know if certain areas of the country are over-prescribing this drug to women of childbearing age. And I would add my voice to the call for a public inquiry into this national scandal, and that we have an adequate compensation package for all those many people and their families who are affected by this national scandal.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I again would like to pay tribute to the member from North Norfolk for getting this debate and trying to air this issue again. Epilepsy affects 1% of the population, that's 600,000 people. And it is not a trivial condition, it is dangerous. As we heard, 1,200 people a year die of epilepsy, and we mustn't diminish that. At the lowest level, if you have a fit after being well controlled, suddenly you can't drive again. That's quite a big impact on people, and at the other end, death. So we must be really careful that we do not send out a message that anti-epileptics are bad, or even Epilim. It works really well, and it is one of the drugs that is often able to control particularly the most dangerous seizures, the tonic-clonic or grand mal as it used to be called, with one drug. Almost all anti-epileptics carry risk. Now, sodium valproate is the worst by far, but all the ones that you've heard of in the past, phenytoin, phenobarbital, primidone, carbamazepine, they all carry some risk. So I think we have to recognise it's not just like the doctors prescribed the wrong drug. This is really hard to deal with. And what we need is that people have specialist input. And so what we're really asking for is that when girls reach puberty, until they reach either menopause or into their 50s, when there is no risk of them having children, that the decisions are made with them by specialists. Now, we've heard that obviously there was recognition right back in the 70s that there could be congenital abnormalities brought about by sodium valproate. But what appears to have changed is the scale. We see, if you look back, they talk about 2% risk of malformations and some possibility of developmental delay. What we see now is we're talking 10% of children with a birth defect, which might be something like cleft palate. It might be a minor cleft palate that can be dealt with. It could be right through to spina bifida that means that child is facing major physical disability. But on a much worse scale, 40%, almost half of them, facing some form of developmental delay that can mean autistic spectrum, learning difficulty, ADHD. And that is a big change. So what we have is the recognition, as one of the earlier members, and I've forgotten the name of her constituency, talked about the paper in '95 that started to really bring these cases together. What you have before that is predominantly case reports. Somebody going, oh, this is odd, I'll write it up. But you actually require that someone brings that together. And when we hear there's 400 babies a year being born since the recent attempt to deal with this, what you realise is, had the reporting system, the yellow card system, actually been working, where we might have had 500, 600, 700, 800 a year of these cases, that would have been spotted much more quickly. So the system failed utterly in recognising a pattern. And I would say that has to be reformed. I think if a woman gives birth to a child with a birth defect, or in the very early years, recognition of some kind of major developmental delay, and she's on a drug, I don't care what the drug is, I feel that should be reported. Because that GP may never have seen it before, may not recognise that this could be an association. But someone sitting in MHRA who's receiving 400 or 500 of them certainly ought to recognise that. What we obviously have going forward is how you actually tackle this. And I think one of the shocks is that the toolkit, having been put out in February 2016, as over the last years, this huge scale has been recognised. And that's the change, recognising the scale. To hear that over 2/3 of women have not received any part of it is incredibly disappointing. And I would have to say it's great that there's some marking on the packaging, but maybe actually more of that needs to be combined, because you're not then depending on someone remembering to hand something out or to pick something up. You're actually empowering that woman to say, oh, what's that? You've never talked to me about that. You're starting to have that both sides of the equation have the chance to remember and discuss it. We've predominantly focused on the use of sodium valproate in pregnancy and the results of that. But by the time a woman is pregnant, as the Honourable Member for... Strangford... I'm not doing very well today. 650 names is hard enough. Adding another 650 just does my head in. Anyway, mentioned that by the time the woman is pregnant, and knows she is pregnant, crucially, it is too late. Because these abnormalities happen in the first trimester, the first 3 months, when the brain and spinal cord is forming, when the arches of the face are combining. And that's why it's particularly neural tube defects, brain function abnormalities, and cleft palate. And so many women leading hectic lives may already be 2 months pregnant by the time they finally know. And that means it's too late. So that's why the annual review is important. And if there are children on Epilim, and Epilim is perfectly fine to use in a girl if that gives good control for grand mal seizures. But it needs to be flagged up that when it is expected she's approaching puberty, these discussions need to start with her and her family. Family planning is important for all women. But for women on these kind of drugs that must be stopped in pregnancy, it's absolutely crucial. And so what we need is to have that discussion, to look at the alternatives. I would echo the comment about if a woman is pregnant and did not plan not to just stop the drug on her own, she should have emergency access to a specialist who is able to look at her type of epilepsy and discuss with her, would it be safe to just take nothing? Is it better to change to something else? But to recognise that to actually face uncontrolled seizures in pregnancy can cause you to lose the mother and the baby. And we mustn't have any kind of irresponsibility around not flagging that up. We had a debate in this chamber last week on baby loss. Again, a very powerful cross-party debate on the anguish that people face, whether it's early miscarriage, stillbirth, or neonatal loss. And we talked about that loss and bereavement. But any of us, whether male or female, who have had children, know the expectation and joy of waiting for a child. And therefore there is still exactly that bereavement when we know that our child is going to face a life of difficulty, of physical and mental difficulties, of learning disability. We know that a child with marked learning disability has only a 7% chance of working. So for the parents, the stress of knowing that there will come a point when they're not there, and how will their child, maybe now a young adult, actually survive facing a harsh world. So I think having financial support is absolutely crucial to give families peace of mind. I think we do need an inquiry, but I think rather than multiple inquiries, I think actually bringing some of these common themes together into one would be much more powerful to get people to recognise we are talking relentlessly repeating patterns. So let's try and reform the things that allowed this to happen, and let's make sure we support the families and the children to whom sadly it has happened.
Shadow Minister Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It really is an honour to be responding for the second time today in this chamber on behalf of the opposition. Firstly, I want to start by thanking the Honourable Member for North Norfolk for securing this very important debate today. It really is a much needed one to finally discuss in detail and in Parliament, in the main chamber, the issues around Valproate and what the government must be doing to address this injustice. He spoke with such passion and obvious outrage on behalf of the thousands of women and children affected by this disgraceful scandal. I too want to thank the other honourable members who've taken part in this debate today, the Honourable Member for Congleton, Newport West, Eastleigh, Hayward and Middleton, Bury North, who gave an extremely moving account of how this drug helped him as a young boy, making the point that when used correctly, as we've heard, this can be a very good drug. There was also the Honourable Member for Strangford, Lancaster and Fleetwood, and the Honourable Lady who speaks for the SNP from Central Ayrshire. It's been a very good debate. As we've heard, the issues of Valproate and the effects it has on fetuses are not new. In fact, they span a significant number of years, going back as far as the 1970s and 80s, when the first cases of the effect of Valproate were documented. Even recent scientific research has shown that Valproate can have an impact on a child's life, including a study finding that 10% of children exposed to Valproate will be born with a major congenital malformation, 29% requiring additional educational support, and 6% being diagnosed with significant social communication difficulties such as autism. Whilst there have been some movement on making women aware of the risks of Valproate during pregnancy through the Valproate toolkit, as we've heard, there is still far more that should and must be done to support these women and their children affected so seriously by this injustice. The scope of this issue is serious. Data from 2010 shows that over 21,500 women were prescribed Valproate. Whilst not all of these women will have since been or plan to be pregnant, it is worrying that following the toolkit's publication, there is still not enough awareness of the risks, with 85% of patients not receiving the booklet and 90% not receiving the pharmacist's card. It's important that the Minister looks into this matter as a matter of urgency and ensures that more awareness is created to help address this lack of knowledge that could save so many innocent lives from being irreparably, thank you, damaged. I knew I couldn't say it, and I still put it in the speech. As part of this, would the Minister be minded to agree that the NHS should make it mandatory for every clinician prescribing sodium valproate to a woman or a girl of childbearing age to have a conversation with her about the risks during pregnancy upon first prescribing the drug, and then at least yearly before her prescription is renewed? Over the decades, there have been countless opportunities for this drug to be investigated, especially when evidence from the 1980s grew. Yet the various regulatory bodies for medicines have failed to even set eyes on this as an issue worthy of investigation, with only fleeting references in position papers and reports, nothing substantial. This is why it is welcome that the European Medicines Agency, in one of its first public inquiries on the 26th of September this year, called together patients, carers, doctors, pharmacists and academics to look into this matter further. And it will be interesting to see what outcomes come from this investigation upon its conclusion. I also think that we have a duty to set the mistakes or oversights of previous governments right, which is why we are here today, to seek justice for the victims of sodium valproate in pregnancy and their families. This is why we on this side of the House welcome the calls for the Government to look into how they can help compensate these families who have been so significantly affected. Before I continue, it must be noted that this drug, as others have already said, is an effective treatment, and for many it may be the only drug that works for them. Nevertheless, there is a systematic failure to inform women of the dangers of taking valproate. If expectant mothers had had the risks laid out clearly for them, then many children would not have been harmed, and I hazard a guess that we would not be debating this issue today. This is why Labour promised in our election manifesto earlier this year that we would look into this further by holding a public inquiry if we'd won the general election. So we now make this plea to the Government. The evidence collected by InFact shows that despite the Government, pharmaceutical companies and regulatory bodies knowing about the risks for 40 years, this knowledge was withheld from women, which meant they were unable to make informed decisions about their drug treatment during pregnancy. I must ask the Minister, why have we not got to the bottom of this injustice? And isn't it about time that we did? A lot of the issues we must understand and investigate are historic, yet for some they are still very prominent in their present. There are many families living with the repercussions of this lack of information given to them. Honourable members may have watched the Victoria Derbyshire show in recent months, where valproate has been discussed, including just last month when Deborah Mann, who took valproate during her pregnancy, discussed how the drug had affected her daughter Branwyn. Deborah had been given a dose of valproate, 5,000 milligrams, which is 5 times higher than the recommended dose of 1,000 milligrams daily. And the fact that any dose above 1,000 milligrams is considered to have the largest level of risk. Branwyn had to wear splints. The daughter, Branwyn, had to wear splints every day since she was a little girl. She is in chronic pain every day, has migraines and has problems with both her brain and eyes. At just 22, Branwyn has been told that she could go blind, have a stroke or even die at any moment. I recently met with the inspirational Janet Williams and Emma Murphy, who a number of honourable members on all sides of the House have paid tribute to, and I now realise that they're actually in the public gallery. They set up InFact in November 2012 after 2 of Janet's children and 5 of Emma's children were diagnosed with fetal anticonvulsant syndrome. And we heard in detail from the Honourable Member for Conglington the extent of the appalling damage to Emma and Janet's precious children, and all of it was preventable. Both Janet and Emma campaigned tirelessly for justice after being told, and in the case of Emma, time after time after time, that these drugs were safe to take in pregnancy. These women did ask the obvious questions when the truth was already well known, and they were still told that these drugs were safe to take while they were pregnant. Can you just imagine how that feels as a mum? I'd be absolutely furious. We all would. I'd want answers. I'd want justice, and so do they. Since 1973, It is approximated that 7,000 children have been harmed by exposure to valproate. No doubt there will be many other families who failed to conceive, had stillbirths or miscarriages, all because of this drug. This is why we must get answers, but it's also we must look at what compensation we can give to these families because of the failures of the NHS to protect and support them. The idea of compensation is one that has been established by our neighbours across the Channel, where the French Parliament has recognised the true scale of this injustice and established a fund worth €10 million to support the victims of Valproate and their families. We on this side of the House believe that mistakes should be recognised, addressed and accordingly compensated for. We also believe that burying our heads in the sands and ignoring the demands of the victims goes against the nature of justice and righting the many wrongs of the past. These families must be supported and allowed to have a full investigation into the failures and damage they have had inflicted upon them. The Minister cannot ignore the scale of this tragedy and the numbers of lives that have been so adversely affected through no fault of their own, but through that of their medication prescribed by the NHS. We are here today to ensure the Government wakes up to the enormity of this scandal and takes immediate action. More must be done to make women aware of the risks of taking valproate during pregnancy now, ensuring that the injustice which has gone on for far too long is righted and answers are found and support provided to these families who have seen their lives turned upside down because of what can only be described as a cover-up. The Minister should and must listen to what has been said today. I hope that he will assure the House that he has constructively listened and will go away and start the process of righting this pernicious wrong by holding a full public inquiry and properly supporting these families. They need, want and deserve justice, Mr Deputy Speaker. They should, at long last, receive nothing less.
Minister for Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I would like to start by congratulating the Right Honourable Member for North Norfolk on securing this debate through the good offices of the Backbench Business Committee. He has, as he's indicated today, taken a particular interest in this since his time. It was brought to his attention during his time as a Minister in the Department of Health, and I think all tribute to him for being so persistent in that endeavour. This is a very important issue, and members across the House have come together once again, as has been pointed out by the member of Central Ayrshire, 2 weeks in a row to demonstrate the concerns which are not party political. This is affecting all of our constituents, irrespective of any party political alliance. And we've had some very constructive suggestions made across the House and a number of personal incidents of cases which constituents have brought to the attention of members, which I think has been very moving. And rather than rehearse them, I would just point to my honourable friend, the member for Congleton, who went into some detail, as a member for Washington Sunderland West said, about the particular circumstances of the two outstanding campaigners who I'm pleased are here to witness this debate, who've spoken so powerfully about the effects that valproate has had on their lives and those of their children. Like them, I have very great sympathy for those families who've been affected by valproate use in pregnancy. The Association of British Neurologists advises that valproate remains the most effective treatment for generalised epilepsy, and this is reflected in NICE guidelines. For some women with epilepsy, it may be the only effective treatment, the only thing which prevents a potentially life-threatening seizure. But because of its risks, valproate should only be used to treat women of childbearing age if other drugs are ineffective or not tolerated. This is not a clear case of use or no use. This was clearly pointed out by the Honourable Member for Central Ayrshire, who speaks with authority on these matters. The key challenge for clinicians is to ensure that the drug is used only by those who really need it, and that they are fully informed about the risks and that their treatment is closely monitored. Very briefly.
Share my aspiration. Should be aiming to ensure that every woman, wherever they live, have access to a specialist unit.
I will come on to how I think access needs to be improved and monitoring as I wind up my remarks. As my honourable friend, the member for Eastleigh, acknowledged, it is vital that no woman stops taking Valproate or any other anti-epileptic without first discussing it with their doctor and, if necessary, with a relevant specialist. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, is currently working with European regulators and with experts and healthcare bodies to decide what further action should be taken. Like many anti-epileptics, Valproate has always been known to carry a risk if taken during pregnancy, but as honourable members have pointed out today, important questions have been raised here in the Chamber and over the years about the extent to which women have been informed about the risks over the decades. At the time that Valproate was first marketed in 1974 for the treatment of epilepsy, animal studies had shown that there might be a risk of birth defects. Health professionals were made aware of this and were expected to weigh the benefits against the risks. Difficult prescribing decisions had to be made. Campaigners and the Honourable Gentleman in his opening remarks have highlighted the minutes of a meeting of the Committee on Safety of Medicines in 1973, where the committee concluded that it would be best not to mention the risk of birth defects in package inserts. As has been referred to today, this paternalistic attitude has no place in the NHS of today. Now, patients and doctors are expected to make decisions based on open communication on the risks and benefits of a treatment which is underpinned by legislation. But that was not always the case, and the views expressed by the CSM in 1973 were not unusual at that time, particularly in relation to life-saving medicines such as anti-epileptics. I'm pleased to say that medical practice has changed considerably since then, and comprehensive patient information leaflets have been a legal requirement since 1999. Warnings have been issued when new evidence on risks has become available. The MHRA issued bulletins in 1983 and 1993 to update prescribers on the risk of birth defects, and in 2003 warned about a possible risk of developmental delay in children exposed to Valproate during pregnancy. Warnings were extended to include a risk of autism in 2010, and a reminder bulletin was issued in 2013. But information on the full magnitude and nature of the risks with Valproate first became available in 2013, following a long-term follow-up of children whose mothers had taken Valproate and other anti-epileptics. And given these concerns, the MHRA initiated and led a Europe-wide review, which completed in November 2014. The finding of this review was that there was still a clinical need for Valproate, despite the significant risks to the child if taken in pregnancy. Valproate should remain an option for women of childbearing potential only where other treatments had failed or were not tolerated. To mitigate the risks, the recommendation was that women should use effective contraception and treatment should be supervised by a specialist. The MHRA sent a letter to doctors and pharmacists in January 2015 about the strengthened restrictions. But as well as updating statutory information, the MHRA has developed the Valproate toolkit referred to by other honourable members. And although, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm not allowed quite properly to use props while I'm at the dispatch box, I cannot resist pointing out to honourable members that the packaging, the warnings now on Valproate packaging include a very specific warning, which I will read, which says, "Warning for women and girls. This medicine can seriously harm an unborn baby. Always use effective contraception during treatment. If you're thinking about becoming pregnant or you become pregnant, talk to your doctor straight away." In addition to that warning on the packages, there are other elements of the toolkit which I won't trouble the House to read, but including patient cards, information for patients, information for prescribers and clinicians. The toolkit was distributed to doctors and pharmacists in February 2016. Messages sent through different channels then and subsequently have reinforced the recommendation of its use to support discussions with patients. Given the importance of the issue, the former Minister for Life Sciences in the autumn of 2015 brought together healthcare bodies to support the promotion of the toolkit and ensure coordinated messaging to health professionals and patients. The MHRA further developed this group into a 39-strong stakeholder network of health system organisations, health professional bodies, charities and campaign groups, which include, in fact, Facts Aware, OACs and Epilepsy Action, the Epilepsy Society and the Royal College of General Practitioners and the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. Our communication strategy has been informed at every step by the Valproate stakeholder network, including NHS England. Responding to concerns about gaps in awareness identified by several members in the debate today, in July of this year, the toolkit was redistributed to GPs and specialist prescribers, and additional materials were distributed to pharmacies. Over 100,000 healthcare professionals in total have received the toolkit this year. So what are we doing beyond that? We are tracking changes in prescribing. Data shows that between 2012 and 2017, there's been an approximately 26% decline in the number of women of childbearing age treated with Valproate. The decline is sharper amongst 10 to 17-year-olds. And although usage is declining, there has not been the step change that we would want to see, and the results of surveys of patient awareness of the risk, again as referred to today, clearly indicates that more needs to be done. I'm aware that campaigners have called for the use of the toolkit to be made mandatory. The MHRA and NHS Improvement have sent a patient safety alert in April of this year, which directs organisations to identify systematically women and girls taking Valproate and to support them to make informed choices. MHRA and NHS Improvement are monitoring implementation of this alert and are following up directly with relevant organisations. And this action has been taken consistently across the UK and through the devolved administrations. The MHRA is fully involved in the new Europe-wide review to look into whether further restrictions are needed, and an expert working group of the Commission on Human Medicines, a committee of MHRA, has been convened to inform the UK position during this EU review, which is expected to conclude early in the new year. The review is also looking carefully at whether there is any evidence of adverse effects in babies whose father took Valproate. I'm sure the whole House will have been very moved by the personal testimony of the Honourable Member for Bury North of the consequences of childhood meningitis in his 6 years on Valproate to control epilepsy. I hope I've made clear that we are taking this seriously. I have enormous sympathy for those families who've been affected by Valproate use in pregnancy. And in the short time that I have available, I'd just like to touch on a couple of the issues specifically raised by the Honourable Member. He talked about support. We do have an established system reinforced by the Children and Families Act of 2014 to establish a new framework for local authorities and CCGs to secure services for children and young people who have special educational needs or disability. I'm not going to get into here because the question of compensation or inquiry. What I would say to the Honourable Gentleman is that there is a meeting arranged for the Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group to discuss with the my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary for Health, and the issues that he's raised, I think, should be brought forward to that meeting. I would encourage other members of the All-Party Group to join him in coming to that meeting at the Department. I will look at the feasibility of extending the yellow card system as described by honourable members. I do think it is right that we shine the spotlight of transparency to improve patient safety. No government has done more than we have in other areas to do this. I think the victims of Valproate deserve nothing less.
Norman Lamb. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank sincerely all honourable and right honourable members for an incredibly well-informed, responsible, but also very powerful debate today. This is a fight for justice. The Minister is right that we have a meeting planned for the 7th of December with his colleague, the Noble Lord O'Shaughnessy. And I hope very much by then that the Government will have reached a view on the case for compensation. It seems to me that the government has a choice here. It can either deny the unanswerable moral case for treating these people properly, or it can take a moral lead and accept that the state has a responsibility to these families. I hope very much that it's the latter, but I thank all honourable members for participating in this debate.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.